One more reminder that there is an exam in this class next week, first midterm next Wednesday. There'll be a review in class on Monday by the GSIs. I think I've got all the DSP accommodations now. If I haven't, act fast because we have to make arrangements for you. Okay, just to remind you of the coverage, everything from the beginning of the course until the end of business today. Lots of resources for the exam on the course website. Go to the course website, click on exam information in the navigation bar, and you'll get everything you need. If you have any questions, post them to the forum of the course bulletin board, and we'll get an answer to you just as soon as we can. 50 multiple choice questions, computer scored, roughly half from the lectures, roughly half from the text. So you've got to bring your own Scantron form. We don't supply those. And you've got to bring your own pencils as well. And that's what the Scantron form looks like. Some of you have already got it. You've got the ones I've seen. They're the right ones. And there's that. Last time I focused on what's known as the ecological view of perception, a view that says that perception is simply a matter of extracting information about the distal stimulus from the proximal stimulus, by which is meant the entire pattern of proximal stimulation that falls on the sensory surfaces of the perceiver. And I illustrated the ecological view with a run through various principles by which we recover information about depth or distance, the distance between the distal stimulus and the perceiver, and noted that there are some cues to distance that require 2 eyes, some that require only 1 eye. Some of these cues are ocular in nature in that they're provided by feedback from the musculature of the eyes itself, and others are optical in nature in that they have to do with the pattern of light that falls on the retina. These cues, relative size, superposition, shadowing, and so on, are sometimes known as pictorial cues because they have been used by artists, at least Western artists, since the time of the Renaissance to convey depth or distance, 3 dimensions, in 2-dimensional surfaces like canvases and frescoes. Just to review again, what's going on here is that from the ecological point of view, all the information that the perceiver needs to see objects in depth, to perceive distance, is provided by the entire pattern of proximal stimulation that falls on the perceiver's sensory systems. And Gibson argued that over evolutionary time, our perceptual systems evolved to extract just that stimulation that's relevant for perceiving depth, motion, and so on. So this is, as somebody pointed out on the forum this morning, a kind of nativist view of perception, that the perceiver comes into the world with all the equipment that it needs to extract this kind of information. It's part of the perceiver's innate biological endowment, doesn't require any learning, doesn't require any experience, doesn't require any so-called higher mental processes involved in reasoning, judgment, and inference. Like the stimulus response view of learning, the ecological view of perception is an extremely powerful and extremely attractive view of this particular cognitive process. But like the stimulus response theory of learning, it is a limited view of perception, and there are some important problems with it, which is what I'm going to devote today's lecture to. Where we're headed is an alternative view of perception, which is known as the constructivist view, summarized most aptly by the psychologist Jerome Bruner, that basically says that in perception, the perceiver must go beyond the information given by the stimulus. Gibson said all that's needed for perception is to extract information from the stimulus. Bruner argued that that wasn't enough, that you had to do more than simply extract stimulus information. One reason for that is sometimes stimulus information is just insufficient for perception. The stimulus does not provide you with what you need to figure out what it is, where it is, what it's doing, and so on. And also, sometimes, as we'll see in a little while, stimulus information is misleading. Okay? Stimulus information conveys a misleading perception, a misleading impression of what the stimulus is like. For Gibson, perception is a mechanical process. For Bruner, perception is an intelligent process that requires that the perceiver bring to bear on the act of perception his or her knowledge of the world, and requires the perceiver to make various kinds of judgments, various kinds of inferences, to engage in reasoning and problem solving in an effort to figure out what it is that is out there, where it is, and what it's doing. Here is an example of what some people take to be a limitation of the ecological view. It's a phenomenon known as size constancy. Remember from our discussion on Monday, the size-distance rule, that the distance of an object to the perceiver is a function, actually an inverse function, of the size of the retinal image cast by that object on the perceiver's retina. And here's an example of how this might not work. Here's a lion, and it's far away from the eye. And when this lion is far away from the eye, it casts a relatively small image on the retina. Here is a lion that has come closer to the eye, if you will, and this lion casts a much larger image on the retina. But you don't, when a lion comes closer to you, you do not perceive it getting bigger. Okay, you don't say, oh, that's a nice little lion over there, and oh, wow, it's a really big lion over here. You don't do that. You perceive the lion getting closer, but you don't perceive the lion getting bigger. Size remains constant, perceived size remains constant, despite changes in the size of the retinal image that occur as a function of the object getting closer. So here you have an example where the proximal stimulus is changing, the size of the retinal image is changing, but the perception is remaining constant. Okay? There's a discrepancy between what the information is and what the perception is. Here is a broader, more abstract definition of what these perceptual constancies are all about. In every case of perceptual constancy, the pattern of proximal stimulation changes. In the case of size constancy, the retinal image gets larger, but the perception of the distal stimulus, the mental representation of the distal stimulus, remains constant. In the case of size constancy, the object is perceived as getting closer, but it's not perceived as getting larger. The 19th century German psychologist von Helmholtz worried about this problem, and he said, it's as if the perceptual system is making inferences, okay, about the size and the distance of the object, performing certain kinds of calculations, but you're not aware of these calculations as you're performing them. They're being performed unconsciously. We can't really specify what these calculations are. We know them only by inference. But the general idea that Helmholtz had was that here the perceiver is going beyond the information given by making the inference that the object is getting closer rather than growing in size, okay, compensating for these distance cues. So here, in fact, is what really happens. You never see just a pure lion in the distance, right? There's always some kind of background. So what happens here is that when the lion is far away, you might see him walking out of a forest or something. That's supposed to be a tree, okay? And the lion and the tree cast an image of one size on the retina. Here, as the lion emerges from the forest and comes closer to the perceiver, the retinal image of the lion becomes larger, but the comparison between the lion and the tree changes. And what's happening is the perceptual system is taking account of the changed relationship between the retinal size of the lion and the retinal size of the tree up here, and the retinal size of the lion and the retinal size of the tree here. There's a kind of calculation that the perceptual system performs. So now we see that there are two kinds of cues, or if you will, two kinds of information that contribute to the perception of constancy. The first is not just the retinal size of the lion you're looking at, but the size of the retinal image of everything you're looking at. The comparison of the object with its background will give you a true picture of whether that's a lion that's growing in size or a lion that's coming nearer. And if you think about it for a second, the comparison of the object with its background, those kinds of unconscious inferences are actually consistent with the Gibsonian view, because what Gibson says is that all the information you need for perception is provided by the entire pattern of stimulation. Not just the stimulation that comes from the object you're looking at, the lion, but also the image, the stimulation that comes from the background of the object, like the trees and the forest. But it's also the case, and this is what's consistent with the Brunner view of things, that we know something about the size of trees and we know something about the size of lions. And it's this world knowledge that we have that we apply when we see, when the retinal image of the lion gets larger. We know that lions don't suddenly expand in size. Okay, we know that about creatures. And so we take that knowledge about the world and use that to construct a perception of the lion as coming closer rather than getting bigger. So again, we have the retinal size story is actually consistent with Gibson's ecological view, but there's this other story about the knowledge that we have that we bring to bear on the act of perception, and that's consistent with the Brunerian view. Yes? Well, the retinal image of the things that are getting bigger. That's right, okay, but they're not getting bigger themselves. Well, for one thing, you know you're moving, okay, because you're driving the car or you're walking or whatever. But again, the story is the same. If you, the perceiver, are in motion, okay, the size of the retinal image cast by the objects that you're approaching is going to get bigger. But Gibson would say, look, you got to think about the retinal size of the object you're approaching compared to the retinal size of all the other objects in the background. And if you make that comparison, you don't see the object getting bigger, you see the objects getting closer. Brunner would say, yeah, that's true, but it's also true that we know about the size of the trucks we meet on the highway, okay? When you go to pass an 18-wheeler, the 18-wheeler doesn't get bigger, okay, and then get smaller in your rearview mirror. You don't perceive it as, oh, that's a little truck now, okay? You say, oh, it was close to me, now it's far away. And because you know that trucks don't change in size either, okay? So point here for the constancies is that there are two different kinds of principles involved. One is the Gibsonian comparison of the object with its background, okay? The other is bringing to bear what you know about the world as you construct your perception of the world. Let me go on and give you another example of this. Here is shape constancy. Here's a door, which with its characteristic rectangular shape. But as the door opens, notice that the shape of the door becomes more trapezoidal, okay? These parallel lines become not parallel anymore. This line becomes longer than this line. That's even more so as the door opens even more. But you don't perceive the door is changing in shape, okay? This is shape constancy. Despite changes in the pattern of stimulation from these square sides to these angled sides, you don't see the object as changing in shape. So here we have the first challenge to the Gibsonian view that all the information you need for perception is provided by the stimulus, because here stimulus information is changing, at least to some extent, but the perception is remaining constant. Here is another example. This is a white vase against a black background. Here's the base, here's the stem, here's the lip of the vase. But then when you look at it, what else do you see? You see some faces. Here is a forehead, a nose, lips, chin, neck, forehead, nose, lips, chin, and neck. If you look at the white part, you see a vase. If you look at the black part, you see faces, okay? This is the Rubin vase, Rubin face vase figure, invented by a guy named Rubin. But the point here is that the pattern of stimulation has remained constant. Haven't changed anything up here, okay? But despite the fact that the pattern of stimulation remains constant, your perception of the object can change depending on whether you look at the white part or you look at the black part. You see a vase against a white vase against a black background, or you see black silhouettes against a white background. Here we begin to see our second major challenge to the Gibsonian view of perception. This is a figure known as a reversible figure. A reversible figure because the perception will change. If you reverse figure and ground, you see two quite different kinds of things. Here's another example, the so-called Necker cube. And what I want you to do is just look at it for a couple of seconds. People who are way off on the side may not get this effect. What's happening? What's happening? Yeah, two different parts pop out, okay? Sometimes this corner A seems to be nearer to you than this corner B. But on other occasions, this corner B seems closer to you than the corner A. Okay, so which is nearer to you? The stimulus isn't enough, okay, to provide you with this information. It all depends on how you look at it. But again, the point here is that the pattern of stimulation is staying constant, but the perception of the object is changing. This is another reversible figure, sometimes known as an ambiguous figure, because it's not at all clear which of these features is in the foreground and which of them is in the background. But it's nothing about the pattern of stimulation that's causing perception to change, okay? The perception is changing despite the fact that the stimulation is remaining constant. This is a figure that you'll find in art, especially medieval and Byzantine art. It's known as the Antioch cube. This is a wall from the Mission San Javier del Bac church in Tucson, Arizona. It's all painted like this. It's been that way since about the 18th century. And again, what you can see here is a version of the Necker cube. Sorry, my flash went off. All right. I didn't realize it was going to look like that days before digital pictures. But here's another version that's very much like the Necker cube. It's known as the Schroeder staircase, set of stairs. And as you look at it, you'll see that your perception of the set of stairs reverses. Sometimes you see this wall as closer to you than this wall, with the stairs going up. Okay, you got it, see? Now you see this wall as nearer to you, with the stairs it's kind of like the Poseidon adventure or something, right? The world turned upside down. Again, same thing. You could see this as an artistic variant on the Schroeder staircase, though this was painted long before Schroeder ever came onto the earth. Here is a picture of a demure young woman with her head turned away from the perceiver. Here is her scarf, her hair. She's got a feather in her hat. Here is her eyelid, her nose, her chin, some kind of fur here, a necklace around her neck. Very nice picture. Or you can see a kind of craggy older woman, one eye here, a long kind of crooked nose, pursed lips, sharp chin, her hair here. This is a cartoon that first appeared in the British humor magazine Punch, was discovered by E.G. Boring, who's a famous psychologist now deceased. It's sometimes known as My Wife and My Mother-in-Law. Okay. But again, the picture hasn't changed. The stimulation remains constant, but the perception can change depending on how you look at it. You either see a young, fairly pretty young woman turned away from the perceiver, or you see a somewhat not so pretty, not so young woman staring down the perceiver. Stimulus remains constant, the perception changes. Here's another example. This is a picture of a duck. Here is the duck's beak, the duck's eye, the duck's neck, the back of the duck's head. Or it's a rabbit with the rabbit's ears, the rabbit's eyes. I always love this lecture. You get so much good feedback, right? The little rabbit's mouth, and so on. This picture originally appeared in a German humor magazine called Der Fliegende Blatter, which I think means the flying bladder, but I'm not sure. In any event, the American psychologist Joseph Jastrow picked this up, and it's now known as the Jastrow rabbit-duck figure. Again, the stimulus remains constant, but the perception changes depending on how you look at it. These are, again, known as ambiguous figures. Sometimes reversible figures, sometimes they're known as bistable figures. And the important thing about them is that the pattern of proximal stimulation remains constant. The image cast by the object on your retina doesn't change at all. But the perception changes depending on what you focus on and how you identify various features of the object, where you go beyond the information needed, provided by the stimulus. You go beyond that information, drawing on your own world knowledge, your expectations, your beliefs, and so on. Then you will see objects differently, even though the stimulus remains the same. This is, going back to Rubens' vase for a second, this was a vase produced in England for the Silver Jubilee, the 25th wedding anniversary of Queen Elizabeth II and her consort, Prince Philip. And it's a very nice vase, okay? But when you view the vase against the black background, what you see is Philip's profile here and Elizabeth's profile here. It's a lovely commercial adaptation of the idea of the reversible figure. When I was in college, college students everywhere had these things on their walls, posters by the Swiss artist M.C. Escher. And again, what Escher does in his art makes a lot of use of reversible figures. You can perceive, this is his painting Day and Night, you can perceive this as white birds flying to the right, or you can perceive it as black birds flying to the left. Not enough information in the object to tell you what's what, okay? It's how you look at it. Here we have another Escher painting, Circle Limit 4, which you can see white angels against a black background, or you can see black bats against a white background. Again, all the information isn't sufficient to tell you what it is. Is it a picture of angels or is it a picture of bats? Here is a painting by Salvador Dali of a market, a North African market. Here's a person sitting at a table with an urn. There's some ruins here, and you're looking out on a vista of desert. Everybody see that? How about the figure of the French philosopher Rousseau right here, with his brow, his two eyes, his nose, his mouth, his chin, and so on. This painting is called Voltaire. Slave Market with Disappearing Bust of Voltaire is the title of this painting. And again, it's all there. Dali used this reversible figure a lot in his paintings. If you ever see an exhibit of Salvador Dali's paintings, you'll see him use these bistable figures quite a bit. Okay, so again, the point here is that the stimulus is remaining constant, but the perception changes depending on how you think about it. So stimulus remains constant, the perception changes depending on what parts of the object you pay attention to. The perceiver is actively constructing the perception, not mechanically extracting information from the stimulus. So in the constancies, we have perception remaining constant despite change in the stimulus. In the reversible figures, we have perception changing despite stability in the stimulus. In either way, we have dissociated, if you will, perception from stimulation. We've shown that perception is not just a matter of recovering the information provided by the stimulus. Here's another class of examples. This is what's known as the Müller-Lyer illusion, where, again, if you're way over on the side, you may not see this quite so well, but most people see this horizontal line, the top line, as longer than this line. Though it's not. Okay, you can see that it's not. Everybody can see that those two lines are exactly the same in length. But knowing it doesn't make any difference, right? You look at the Müller-Lyer illusion, again, it still looks longer, right? You know it's not, but it still looks longer, okay? This is known as the Müller-Lyer illusion. I'll give you another example of it. Here is a real-life example taken from inside and outside a commercial office building, where you have this vertical bar here with the so-called arrows, okay? And here we're looking from the inside, this vertical bar with the feathers, and this bar looks longer than this one, even though they're not. I mean, you can match them up if you want to look at it on the course website, or you can see right here, these are parallel lines. This line and this line exactly the same length. But still, doesn't look that way. Okay, doesn't look that way at all. Here is another version of this. This is known as the Ponzo illusion. This line, the topmost line, top line, typically appears to be longer than the bottom line. Even though it's not, you can see that they're exactly the same length. But again, take away those cues, and the length of this line jumps right back into the picture. What's going on here? These illusions are another example of what Helmholtz called unconscious inferences. The upper line, remember what's going on here, especially you can see it especially in the Ponzo illusion. You can think of these lines as perspective lines, lines converging towards a vanishing point in the distance, as in the linear perspective rule that I talked about last time. But now if you think about these things as receding in distance, and you apply the size-distance rule, this object casts an image on the retina that's exactly the same as this line, but if you perceive this line as farther away because of the distance cues provided by these converging lines, then your perceptual system will conclude that this line must actually be longer. This line should be longer than this one if this line, being farther away, is going to cast an image of the same size as this line. What's happening here is it's as if the perceptual system goes through a kind of syllogism, okay? The upper line appears farther away, but the size of the retinal image of the upper line is the same as the size of the image of the lower line. Therefore, a conclusion, an inference, therefore it must be that the upper line is longer than the lower line. And again, these unconscious inferences that create the illusion that one line is longer than another, when in fact it is not, are part of the perceptual act of going beyond the information given by the stimulus, applying what we know about size and distance relations to construct a mental representation, a percept that is not necessarily the same as the object we're perceiving. Something very similar happens with the Miller-Lyer illusion. You can think of these feathers here as if they're converging lines, so they provide information about distance, okay? So if this line is perceived as farther away from this line, but the retinal sizes are the same, then you'll conclude that this line must actually be bigger than the other one. The mechanism behind the Miller-Lyer illusion and the Ponzo illusion, basically the same, okay? The perceptual system is taking account of distance cues to make inferences about size. It's not recovering information about size from the stimulus, it's making an inference about what the size might be. Here's another example. You got a really good view of it last night, if you were looking the right way, because there's a beautiful full moon outside. And this is a full moon rising over the East Bay Hills. There's Alcatraz Island. And what you notice when you look at the moon as it rises over the hills is that it looks huge. Okay? But then you go out later at night and you look at the moon up in the middle of the sky, looking at the moon at zenith. It doesn't look so big, right? This is what's known as the moon illusion. Okay? The moon illusion is that the moon on the horizon appears to be larger than the moon when viewed at zenith. It's not, okay? It's just not. The moon doesn't change in size as it crosses the sky. But what happens is the visual system takes into account distance information provided by objects on the horizon, to give an impression that the moon is very large. When you look at the moon overhead, you don't have those distance cues any longer. So you see the moon pretty much the size that it is. So again, the moon illusion is another example of a percept being created by unconscious inferences, by going beyond the information given by the stimulus, okay, to make things appear different from the way they actually are. Size constancies, the reversible figures, now the perceptual illusions, a third class of perceptual phenomena that suggests that the ecological view is not quite right, that we do more than extract information from the stimulus. Instead, we go beyond the information given by the stimulus to construct our percepts. Here is another example. This is called the Ames room. There used to be one of these at the Exploratorium over in San Francisco. I think they've temporarily dismantled it now. Anybody been to the Exploratorium lately? Is the Ames room still there?
I think the last time I was at the Exploratorium, I saw the Ames room, but I haven't seen it in a while.
Yeah, okay, well I haven't been over there in a while either. So next time you go, look for this. There are only about 3 Ames rooms in existence now, and the one at the Exploratorium is one of the better ones. Here we have 2 young girls, one who looks very tall, and the other one looks very short. In fact, they're identical twins, and they're as close to the same in size as 2 little kids can get. But when you look at people in the Ames room, what you will see is something like this, where one person seems extraordinarily tall, okay, and the other seems extraordinarily small. The way this works, like this, here's a kind of schematic diagram of the Ames room. When you look into the room, you have a kind of set of expectations about what rooms are going to look like. Rooms are rectangular, okay? They have 90-degree angles at their corners. The floors and the ceilings meet the walls at 90-degree angles. The windows and the doors are rectangular. They have 90-degree angles in them. That's what we expect rooms to look like. And when we look in the Ames room, that's what we expect to see. But in fact, in the Ames room, you're viewing the Ames room through a little hole in the wall here. And it turns out that the ceiling of the Ames room is angled up in a kind of trapezoidal manner so that this corner is way higher than way higher with respect to the floor than this corner is. Moreover, this wall is angled way out with respect to the observer, so that this point here is much more distant from the viewer than this point is. The windows are arranged in a trapezoidal shape so that things kind of look in a particular way. And what happens is you've got a 4-foot tall kid standing here against a 3.5 foot tall ceiling, and you've got a 4-foot tall twin of that child standing here against an 8 or 9 foot high ceiling, giving the impression that the one child is very, very, very tall and the other child is very, very small. This illusion would not work if all we did to get our impressions of size was to unpack the size of the retinal image, okay? What happens here is that we have expectations about what rooms are going to look like. We have expectations about how tall children are, and these expectations lead our perceptions astray, lead us to perceive things differently than the way they actually are. So again, in the Ames room, we have a lack of the usual distance cues. There's very misleading stimulus information. Even the floor here, notice this checkerboard floor creates kind of perspective lines in the way that Raphael's painting the School of Athens did, but these aren't in fact square, okay? They're trapezoidal as well in shape to create this illusion. So there's unconventional geometry. We don't expect it, so we bring to the perception inappropriate expectations about what things are going to look like, so we don't compensate because of the lack of distance cues, because of the unconventional geometry. We don't engage in our usual compensation for differences in retinal size and instead see the world in this very, very strange way. Okay, so again, knowledge, expectations, and beliefs are brought to bear on the act of perception. This is a contribution from inside the head, inside the memory of the perceiver, if you will. It's not just a matter of extracting information from the stimulus. This holds true for certain cultural differences in perception. Here is a picture of a geological formation in New Mexico. It's actually on the Navajo reservation. And it is known mostly as shiprock because the early European settlers looked at this and it kind of reminded them of a clipper ship with masts and sails and so on. But the Navajo and the Apache who lived in this area didn't call it shiprock. They didn't know anything about clipper ships, right? They call this winged rock, because it looked to them as if it was kind of like an eagle's and a hawk's wing. European settlers, with their knowledge of clipper ships, think this looks like a clipper ship. Native Americans, lacking that knowledge, but having lots of knowledge of birds and feathers, think that this object looks like a wing. Cultural differences in knowledge, expectations, and beliefs can create cultural differences in perception. Here's another example. If we ask you what this is, most of you will say it's a whale. Here's its snout, here's its fin, here's its body, here's its tail. Or you could think of it as a kangaroo. Here's its snout and its ear and its foreleg, its body, and its little stubby kangaroo tail. This is known as the whale kangaroo reversible figure. Okay. Now, a lot of you saw the kangaroo once I pointed it out, but it turns out that if you present this figure to Australian college students, they see the kangaroo immediately. Okay. Here, in an experiment we did, we presented the whale kangaroo in what's known as the canonical orientation, that is the way you'd expect to see a kangaroo, and in a non-canonical orientation, we hardly ever see kangaroos like this. No matter how you oriented the figure, everybody, North Americans and Australians, saw the whale and saw the whale immediately, but Australians were more than twice as likely to see the kangaroo than North American students were, and that was especially the case when the figure was presented in its non-canonical version. And the reason for that is that actually Australians see kangaroos that look like this. They see dead kangaroos. They see dead kangaroos strung up on fences. They see kangaroos in all sorts of weird positions because that's something they do with kangaroos there. Country that kills its national animal. But okay, they're a pest for ranches. They're kind of like coyotes in this country. But the point is that Australians know an awful lot more about kangaroos than North Americans do. So they're more prepared to see kangaroos in ambiguous figures like the whale kangaroo, and they're more likely to see this figure in other orientations. Here's another example. The constellations in the sky, the patterns of stars that we look at are often referred to as if they were objects of various kinds. Here's Orion, the hunter, with his legs, his belt, his head, his shield, and his club. Here's Taurus, the bull, with his head and the tips of his horns. If you think about it for a second, this might look a lot like a hunter, but this doesn't look anything like a bull. Okay? But what people did when they wanted to locate stars in the sky was said, all right, we'll make this one kind of sort of like a bull. We'll call it Taurus the bull, right? And people said, well, what makes it like a bull? And someone said, well, look, here's the horns, and here's the face, and so on and so forth. They kind of built up a perception that makes a stimulus that doesn't look very much like a bull into a percept that actually does, in some sense, resemble a bull. And again, different cultures deal with the constellations in different ways. Here is the star pattern, the constellation, that most of us know as Ursa Major, the Great Bear, okay, with the body of the bear here and the bear's tail and some head there. Doesn't look a whole lot like a bear, but that's what we call it. We call it the Great Bear. In France, that same pattern of stars is called La Casserole, okay? Or the Big Dipper. Here is the pot, and here's its handle. In medieval Europe, especially in medieval Spain, the same pattern of stars was looked at, was identified as Charles' wagon. Here is the wagon with the axles of the wheels, and here's the yoke attached to a horse. In England, the same pattern of stars is called the plow. If you go to that bar in Berkeley, the Starry Plow, you'll see this pattern of stars, right? And it's not called Ursa Major, it's called the plow. Some Greeks, and as well as Native Americans, refer to this as the Great Bear. But look at how different the Greek constellation is from the one that's familiar to us now. Here, the bear ranges much more widely than the pattern of stars itself. In China, this same pattern of stars was perceived as the celestial bureaucrat. Okay? You've got a bureaucrat on a podium and some supplicants coming here to talk to him. Doesn't look anything like that. But that's how the object was perceived by the ancient Chinese. That was the perception that they used to guide their orientation in the sky. And then finally, in ancient Egypt, precisely the same pattern of stars was recognized, and it was perceived as a bull and a bull here, and a man, and a weird kind of hippopotamus. Okay? Doesn't look anything like that, but that's how the ancient Egyptians constructed a percept from ambiguous stimulation in the environment of their night sky. One more demonstration of this. What's this? It's a Dalmatian dog, okay? Here's the Dalmatian. Here's his forelegs. Here's his hind legs. He's drinking out of a puddle or something, okay? What's this? Train. Locomotive. Steam. All right. Steam engine. Wheels here, right? What's this? What could this possibly be? Huh? A table with food on it. See these parallel lines here? And there's this surface that's going out to the back. Right. See, what you're doing is you're trying to figure out, what could this possibly be? What do I know in the world that looks like this? The stimulation itself is very ambiguous, but when you start thinking about it for a while, you begin to perceive what the object is. Perception is intelligent activity. It's not just a matter of mechanically extracting information from the stimulus out in the environment. Rather, the perceiver has to actively engage in problem-solving activity, bringing his or her knowledge, expectations, and beliefs to bear on the problem of figuring out what the objects in the world are, where they are, what they're doing, what we can do with them. That's the intelligence of perception, and that is the general thrust of the constructivist view. Thank you very much. You'll be meeting with the GSIs on Monday.